In this final installation of our three-part lecture series on Egypt, we are moving on to the New Kingdom period. And I'm not going to cover all of the New Kingdom period in this lecture. I'm just going to cover a relatively short time looking at just dynasties 18 and 19. Now, what's most important about this period, and we're certainly going to see this reflected in the artwork, was that this was when Egypt was in its height. Let's have a little story time. So at the end of the last lecture, we looked at the troubled expression on the face of the pharaoh Senusret III, and his sad face portended troubles on the horizon. And it was at the end of the Middle Kingdom period that we enter into the Second Intermediate period. And this was a really tough time for Egyptians because it was during this time, the 15th and the 16th dynasties, that they were ruled by a foreign people known as the Hyksos, who came likely from somewhere in West Asia. Scholars are not particularly sure about this, or at least cannot agree on an origin at this point. So this was devastating to the Egyptians because foreignness interrupted the very concept of order that was so important to the Egyptian worldview. The Egyptians, they represented order. And of course they did, because Egyptians knew themselves. It was familiar. It provided a sense of stability. So therefore, everything outside of Egypt and Egyptians was chaos. So now the very forces of chaos embodied in the Hyksos were actually ruling over Egypt. So obviously the Hyksos need to go, and this process began in Dynasty 17, and then the expulsion of the Hyksos was fully realized in Dynasty 18. And this is what ushers in the New Kingdom period. Now, as I said earlier, this was when Egypt was at its height. This was when Egypt was the wealthiest, when it was the most powerful, and when it had the largest territorial expanse. Now, this was attributable to two things. So first, the Egyptians adopted new warfare technology that had been exposed to them during the Hyksos occupation, particularly the composite bow and the chariot. Now, these are going to become really important to the Egyptians because it allowed them to have a more powerful and swift-moving military that could more easily overtake neighboring territories. And by overtaking these territories, they not only took their valuables and began to impose tribute, saying, you're under the rulership of Egypt, you need to pay like a fine or a tax or something like that. And this would obviously pad the coffers to collect riches and tributes, but also by overtaking their trade routes, it allowed for further economic development as well because it expanded the trade infrastructure. These warfare technologies were so helpful and so important that actually, particularly, it was the horse-drawn chariot that then becomes a very important addition to that set of symbols that we've been talking about that pharaohs used to convey their power. And so it shows them, riding on a chariot, and they aren't even holding on, and they're shooting, a bow at the same time. Very epic, very powerful, clearly. Now, when you see wealthy civilizations, you see especially incredible art because they have extra resources to invest in it. So for the New Kingdom period, where this is best evidenced is in their mortuary temples. Now, before we get into the mortuary temple, I just want to say that these temples are what I see as the final step in the evolution of the Egyptian burial structure that was the focus of our last lecture. So it starts as a mastaba, then it goes to the step pyramid, then it goes to the smooth sloped pyramid, then the rock cut tomb, and then finally what we have here, the mortuary temple. Now, keep in mind, we don't want to only just remember the order that these structures emerged, but we want to answer the question why. Why did the structure change from one to the next? And so for the answer to this question, why do we go from the rock-cut tomb to the mortuary temple, is that basically this was like the ultimate workaround. So there was a problem with the rock cut tomb. They were too discreet. The pharaoh and his mummy and his valuable grave goods, they were hidden away somewhere, but there was no giant structure that would sit in the memory of the pharaoh to proclaim his power into infinity. So the mortuary temple is the perfect solution. It's built during the pharaoh's lifetime and would be personally used by the pharaoh to worship the gods. And that certainly conveys power that you get your own private, gigantic temple to worship the gods. And then when the pharaoh dies, they are discreetly buried in the rock cut tomb. Everything's safe, everything's hidden away. But then the temple, it stands in place of the memory. And that memory is kept alive by priests who perform all sorts of cultic rituals to ensure that you're always hanging around in the afterlife. So scholars suggest, and I definitely agree, that when we're talking about the mortuary temple, that it's Hatshepsut's temple that we see here that really was the best of the best in terms of the mortuary temples being built during the New Kingdom period. So first, let's talk about who Hatshepsut was. Hatshepsut, she was the longest running female king of Egypt. Now notice I said king, not queen. She was a pharaoh. Now, she's not the first woman to rule Egypt outright on her own. That person, there's some debate, but in my mind, that person was Sobek-Neferu at the end of the 12th dynasty. You'll come across her in your readings. They refer to her as Neferu Sobek. Either one, same person. Now, she ruled for 3 years and 10 months. And in the grand scheme of things, that's a pretty short time period. And that really limited her ability to make an impact. But this was not so with Hatshepsut. She ruled over 20 years and she proved to be a highly effective leader. In this time, she established all sorts of trade routes and peace treaties. She led the military into war. This is also controversial. Scholars debate this. From the evidence I've seen, I think she did lead the military into war. And Hatshepsut's not the last woman to rule over Egypt. Some people, including myself, wonder if perhaps Queen Nefertiti, who we're going to talk about later in this lecture, whether or not she ruled Egypt as a pharaoh under a pseudonym. And then, of course, there's the super famous pharaoh and last ruler of Egypt before it fell to Rome, and that would be Cleopatra. More specifically, it's Cleopatra the Seventh. Now let's talk about how Hatshepsut came into power. So she was the great wife, meaning the first wife, and also the sister of the pharaoh Thutmose II. And when Hatshepsut's husband slash brother died, he died very young, and he left Hatshepsut only with a daughter, no male heir. But there was a lesser wife who had a son, Thutmose III. And he was very young, this son, too young to rule over Egypt. So Hatshepsut ruled for him in a situation known as a regency, meaning that she rules in his stead. He kind of is exposed to the concept that he's going to rule Egypt. He kind of learns the ropes. And then when he's old enough, he takes over as pharaoh. And while Thutmose III is young, everything's kind of going as it, traditionally would. But then Hatshepsut starts maneuvering, and it's actually really brilliant. So I don't want to say bribing exactly, but what she starts to do is she starts to gain favor of Egypt's priests. She starts donating a lot of money to their temples and building them all of these large, fancy religious structures. And they're really liking all of this financial support. And so they just so happen to come together and alert Egypt that they received visions from the god Amun. And Amun said that it should be Hatshepsut that should be the pharaoh, not Thutmose III. And that's exactly what happens because who can argue with this? This is something that Amun himself has asked for. Now, what happened with Hatshepsut and Thutmose III was highly unusual, okay? With Sobek-Neferu, she became pharaoh because there literally was no other male heir that was suitable. So in that instance, the Egyptians made a judgment call. They felt it was better to have a woman in power than to risk political instability by bringing in a new dynastic line. But here, there was a male heir. So, because this was such an unusual situation, Hatshepsut had to sell herself to the Egyptian people. And as we've seen, and as we will continue to see in this class, her strategy is to use art to do so. So she had tons and tons and tons of sculptural images made of herself, which were then located all throughout her empire. And even, for example, if I can go back for a minute, her mortuary temple, this structure alone had over 200 statues depicting this powerful female king. Now, in looking at these sculptures, it's interesting to note the way the image changes over time. So the image on the left, this is a sculpture that comes from the earlier years of Hatshepsut's reign. And you can see that she is very apparently female. Like I think if you would look at this and you didn't know anything, you would say, okay, I'm looking at a female. And this is because there's, identifiable breasts. She's wearing a skirt. Even her body has this kind of soft, rounded fleshiness that we tend to attribute to the female body. The only thing that really might kind of tip us off that we're looking at a pharaoh is we see the Nemes headdress. Now, if you look at the image on the right, if you didn't know anything about Hatshepsut, anything, if I just only showed you that picture, you might not so easily think that you're looking at a female. And in fact, it's pretty ambiguous what exactly we're looking at here. We've got what look like, pectoral muscles, but, they kind of maybe look like breasts. So it's not very clear there. That kind of feminine roundedness, it's still kind of there. You can see it in the hips. But then you have a torso that's a little bit more trim, a little bit more muscular. The face itself, instead of being kind of round and full, it's like thinner and it's more angular. We see also that she's wearing the false beard. It's broken off, but you can look at the chin and you can see that kind of that rough straight line, and look on the chest in between the cloth of the Nemes headdress, and you can see where the beard was carved into the stone. And then, of course, our pharaonic iconography with the Nemes headdress. We've got, at this point now, the war kilt, not a tight-fitting sheath skirt like what she's wearing in the image on the left. And even what she's doing is actually pharaonic iconography. She's kneeling, she's offering up jars. And this idea that only pharaohs could directly give offerings to the gods. So if Egyptians saw this, they would know, okay, in addition to all these clear symbols, this activity lets me know I'm looking at a pharaoh. Now, what's going on here exactly? It wasn't like Hatshepsut was trying to fool anybody and trick the Egyptians into thinking she was male. She used female pronouns in the texts that describe the events of her reign. But the idea is that masculinity, that is tied to power. Those concepts are connected to one another. Keep in mind what I said about Egyptian political sculpture in the first lecture when we looked at that Menkaure dyad. It's not about, a portrait in the sense of what does this person look like? What's their personality like? Those things don't matter. It's about conveying power, period. And so it's interesting because you can see with this image the extent to which the details don't matter. Where here we have gender being this kind of detail that's getting overlooked. So power is something that is inherently masculine. So Hatshepsut conveys herself in that way. Now, every king, they were associated with the god Horus during their life. And this was a tradition we saw all the way back with the Palette of Narmer from Dynasty 1. And then after their death, they are associated with the god Osiris. And this isn't just because Osiris was the god of the dead, but in his mythology, he was a king and he also represented order, which was something that, as we know, pharaohs were expected to maintain. And so at the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, okay, first of all, let's start at the bottom of the staircase. You can see sculptures on either side. These are actually sphinxes in they're Hatshepsut in the form of sphinxes. And we saw examples of this in our last lecture with the Great Sphinx. So she's, continuing on in a tradition of showing pharaohs in this way, this, guardian figure, but at the same time, this very powerful, part human, half lion hybrid situation. Now, then, if you go up the stairs, you can see along the top there are some sculptures that are situated in front of these piers, and we'll take a look at these up close. These are Hatshepsut in the guise of the male deity Osiris. And here her image is even more further masculinized than what we saw with the previous two sculptures, to the point where there's no more ambiguity. You can see the proportions, they're thicker around the waist, which has this effect of slimming out the hips. You've got a much more pronounced beard. And you also have skin color as an important clue as well. If you look at the sculptures, you can see there's like a reddish color on the face, and that is actually indicative of gender as well. So in other cultures, not just Egypt, we see this in Greece, we see this in the Aegean, for example, the Etruscans as well. You would have women with lighter skin and then males with a darker kind of reddish tint. When these sculptures were first created, there was a sense of ambiguity because totally looks like a man, but then the skin color was that of a woman. The sculptures were repainted in this kind of in-between color that wasn't exactly, the skin tone of female, wasn't exactly the skin tone of male. And then it's repainted a third time, what we see here, where you have the skin tone being dark. And so at this point, no ambiguity. We're clearly looking at these images of men. And then, of course, you already know this because you're experts at this point. We've got the pharaonic iconography. In this case, she's wearing the headdress of a unified Egypt. You've got your bowling pin, head jet, and then your red crown, deshret, and combine those together, upper and lower Egypt crowns for a unified Egypt. And then you'll see she's holding something. She's holding a crook and a flail. This is something we also often see pharaohs holding, and these were the tools of Osiris, because another part of his mythology was at one point he was a shepherd. So let's move on to talk about another very fascinating New Kingdom period pharaoh, Amenhotep IV. Now, here's the situation. So Hatshepsut had created a sort of a problem because through her financial support of the priests, she had the backing of priests. They totally supported her, and that was really helpful politically. And so the pharaohs that come after Hatshepsut, they see that's a pretty sound strategy, and so they continue to do the same. So all of this support that the priests are getting starts to make them very wealthy and therefore very powerful, to the extent that they actually start to threaten the power of the pharaoh. So something needed to be done. So during the reign of Amenhotep IV, he comes up with a pretty brilliant solution that had very profound impact, not only on Egypt's religious practices, but their very beliefs as well. He said, "Hey, Egypt, you know how for our entire history we've been polytheistic, that we've worshipped multiple gods? Well, actually, we're monotheistic. We only worship one God, and his name is Aten. Oh, and by the way, only myself and my family can interact with this one God. So by doing this, first of all, he solves the problems with the priests because the whole role of the priests was to act as an intercessor between the people and the gods. Well, now that there's only one God and Amenhotep and his family are the only people that can communicate with him, priests are completely obsolete. Problem solved. But also, this positions Amenhotep IV as not only the most powerful person in Egypt politically, he now becomes the most powerful person religiously as well, turning him into this kind of like priest king. Now, this is obviously going to be something that he's really going to need to sell the Egyptian people on. And how does he do that? You're right. He does it through the art. So he needs to justify why is it that just him and his family could be the only ones to interact with this one god, Aten. He needs to show that they're different and they're special. And he does this by creating what becomes known as the Amarna style. It's a completely new way to not only present the pharaoh in art, but to also present the human body as well. Now, this piece is an example of the Amarna style, although I'm going to admit to you it's not the best example. The only reason why I'm showing it is because this work of art is so famous that I want you to know about it. So this is the portrait bust of Nefertiti, who was the great wife of Amenhotep IV. And what makes her so special here is her beauty. She is more beautiful than you and I could ever even hope to be. And this is not a vain beauty, but it is a deep and profound spiritual beauty. And it's a beauty that's highly idealized. This is like the epitome of perfection. In fact, I would say she's so idealized, she almost looks generic in a way. Now, part of what emphasizes this beauty is her grace and her elegance. And this is seen especially in this thin, elongated neck. And that, I will say, is a good example of the Amarna style, that very thin, elongated neck. And what really emphasizes that thin, elongated neck is that really heavy geometric headdress that she's wearing, which, by the way, that headdress is unique to Nefertiti. She's the only queen that wears that headdress. And what it is actually, it's a geometricized version of the headdress that Amenhotep was very fond of wearing. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes, and you can see an example of that. So let's move on. I want to show you a better example that'll really give you a sense of what the Amarna style was all about. Yeah, there it is. So first of all, who's this guy Akhenaten? This actually is Amenhotep IV. So what happened is in his 5th year, he decides to change his name to Akhenaten. And by doing that, it incorporates the name of the god Aten into his own name, just in case you might have forgotten that him and the god Aten are best bros. Yeah, that's my cat Franklin. He agreed with that. Okay, if we compare Akhenaten's sculpture to that of Menkaure from the Old Kingdom period, we can see how profound these changes are and how, it's crazy. He's not only just like completely changing Egyptian religious traditions, he's totally changing their artistic traditions as well that were established way back in the earlier years of Egypt's history. So it's striking and it's shocking, not only to the Egyptians, but even to our historians as well. Now, we know that the idealized form of the pharaoh, as we see here with Menkaure, 3 things, right? Trim, stiff, muscular. We can't use those descriptors when we look at Akhenaten. We see instead his body is elongated, it's fluid, it's fleshy. You have these, wide hips and this belly that hangs over, and, this kind of sense of like curving, of undulating of the different forms, where Menkaure is so stiff, he's like almost angular. And so the idea is by showing his body like this, it separates him from the earlier pharaohs, where the earlier pharaohs, their bodies all looked like what we saw with Menkaure. Here, it's a new pharaoh, somebody totally different. And that separation is needed because, he's trying to say there's a new religion and he has this very special role in this new religion, something that the other pharaohs didn't participate in. Now, he can't go too crazy, though, because he does need to make sure people still recognize him. And so he has the pharaonic iconography. We've got the headdress, we've got the false beard, we've got the crook and the flail, we've got the war kilts. You can still see that he is definitely still the pharaoh. I also think he kind of looks like the creepy pharaoh guy that was in that movie Stargate. It's my theory that they probably based that character after Akhenaten. So that's just a random thing I'm throwing in there. The other thing I want to throw in here is, don't you think that the body looks kind of feminine? I do. And I think that that was the point. And it's interesting because, like Hatshepsut, we have this another example of a pharaoh manipulating gender, but now it's in the opposite direction, male to female. And so I think that we can kind of draw this conclusion that maybe these conceptions of gender were much more fluid in ancient Egypt. And to me, this is surprising because in so many other ways, their worldview was dependent upon binaries, one or the other. Here, though, there's this interesting intermediate area. And there's a reason, I think, for this, because for Akhenaten, by presenting to the viewer both the masculine and the feminine, he represents the totality of life, its creation and its perpetuation. All things come from him, from Akhenaten, as Aten's earthly representative. Now, this is another classically Amarna image. So let's look at the common stylistic features first. Okay, we've got the elongation. Take a look at the necks. Take a look at the really long torsos. You've got even these elongated heads on these creepy sort of alien babies. You have that fleshiness, especially seen in the bellies. So in that way, very typical. Now, let's talk about something else that's very noteworthy. Typical for the Amarna period, very rare for the other preceding periods, and that is the subject matter of a family portrait. This is so incredibly rare to see a family portrait coming out of ancient Egyptian political art. But knowing what we know about Akhenaten and his political religious strategy, it actually makes a lot of sense. Because remember, his family was part of his propaganda. They too had the ability to communicate with the one God, Aten. And this makes sense because he needed to make sure that his dynasty could go on. If he said, oh, only I can talk with the one God, Aten, well, what happens when Akhenaten dies? So by saying my family, he kind of conveniently is able to make sure that the people who come after him can also rule over Egypt in this monotheistic religious / political system. So what's happening here is that very thing where they are, communing in this sense with the one God, Aten. And Aten, you can see in the top, he's in the middle, he's a disc. Now, this is crazy because this is the first time that we see an Egyptian deity shown strictly in iconographic terms. Usually, it's going to be like a human or like a human-animal hybrid, but here it's just a symbol, and that was very striking as well. It's like the sun disk, and you can see its rays are coming down and, blessing this happy little family. And this is a happy little family. It's actually a very sweet and tender scene that we see here. We've got our pharaoh full on, headdress, kilt, all the iconography, taking a moment out of his busy pharaoh schedule to, give a little kiss to his daughter. These are all daughters that he had with Nefertiti. And then Nefertiti is sitting there and she's holding hands with her daughter, and then the other daughter sits on the lap and caresses her mother's cheek, and it's special. I like that. And I do want to also say, since we're on the topic of Nefertiti, that we see again, another example of a powerful queen. And I say again because a lot of similarities that we saw with Menkare's queen we're seeing here. There's virtually no hierarchical scale. She's only slightly smaller. Their bodies look virtually identical, and they've got very similar headdresses. So to me, this is evidence that we are looking at a very powerful queen. Now, after Akhenaten dies, there's pretty much an immediate rejection of his monotheism and, by extension, the Amarna style. People were not having the change that Akhenaten imposed. Within about a year of his reign, his successor, who was King Tutankhamun, also known as King Tut, his successor leaves the capital city of Amarna, which was the name of the style, as well as the capital city, returns the capital to Memphis, which is signaling a return to tradition. And that was certainly welcomed on the part of the people of Egypt. And in fact, that temporary religion of Akhenaten's was so disliked that people worked to destroy any writings, art, architecture that was produced during this time. And it's a time we call the Amarna heresy. And it's devastating to art historians that this happened because the Egyptians essentially destroyed the evidence, which makes this super important period in the history of Egypt really not as understood as it needs to be. So King Tut, he was Akhenaten's son, and he's, you probably have heard his name. He's at least probably the most famous of all pharaohs. And this wasn't because he was some great pharaoh. He only ruled for 9 years. He died at the age of 19. He was young. But he's famous because his tomb was one of the only ones that's been discovered pretty much intact. And it revealed all these amazing treasures that really appealed to the imagination of the public, both back then when it was discovered by the archaeologist Howard Carter in 1922, and even now, prompting movies such as The Mummy, starring the actor of the ages, Brendan Fraser. Or you could say prompting movies such as The Mummy, starring another actor of our ages, Tom Cruise. Now, in this sculpture, we see Tut. He's alongside the god Amun. Okay, so stop right there. We see Aten, the sun disk is gone. We're back to polytheism, and we're back to gods represented in anthropomorphic or human form. We have a hierarchical scale situation so that you can see that clearly the god is more powerful. And then we've got Tut next too. If we go back for a minute, here, you've got this random disc in the background. It's a shape. There's not a lot we can identify with that. You've got this very large form of Akhenaten, where here it's almost like Akhenaten's even more powerful than Aten himself because of his prominence within the artwork. So different situation, different relationship between the pharaoh and the gods at this point. Now I bring in Menkare again because I want you to see that we do have a lot of the Amarna sculptural traditions going away, but not completely. There are some parts that remain. We do still have a little bit of fleshiness in the form. You can see it in King Tut's face, and you can even see it in his cute little belly that hangs over the top of his kilt. So this whole lecture, we've been talking about Dynasty 18, but what was happening in Dynasty 19? Pretty much the same thing, kicking ass, taking names. And if we want to talk about pharaonic power during this time, we want to be talking about Ramses II. So Ramses lived for a long time, 2/3 of a century, 75 years. So he got a lot done in that time. He was the last great warrior pharaoh, going out, leading the military to victory after victory, which made him very rich and very powerful. And we can certainly see that in his temple here, which is basically cut out of the side of a giant cliff and is essentially a testament to his own greatness. Now, in this vein, the location of the temple is significant. So it's located in Abu Simbel, which is in Nubia. And that was a territory that had been conquered by Egypt at the beginning of Dynasty 18. So relatively recently, since when this magnificent structure was built. You've got 4 statues of the pharaoh in all of his kingly regalia flanking the entryway, and they are giant. Each one of these is 69 feet tall. So any person passing through, and we've got some people down in the doorway so you can get a sense of scale, anybody passing through is going to feel intimidated and insignificant. So in a way, it kind of advertises these like godlike. And there's some more hierarchical scale. If you look down between his legs, you've got members of the royal family who are smaller in size in comparison to Ramses II. But the point is they're definitely bigger than we are still as we make our way through the entrance.